Hi everybody, this is Kyle Thompson with Thompson Burnham Real Estate. I am a real estate agent in Salem, Oregon, and this is my Living in Salem YouTube channel. This channel is really about sharing what I know about Salem with everyone who watches to help them decide if Salem is the right place for them to live. Today, we're going to talk about the class action lawsuits swirling around the real estate industry. There are over 20 class action lawsuits currently underway accusing the NAR, the National Association of Realtors, and most of the large real estate brokerages in the United States of colluding to keep buyer agent commissions artificially high. These cases are starting to have a real impact on the real estate industry. So in today's video, I'm going to give a little background about these cases, how they are changing the industry, what it means for buyers and the real estate agents, and questions that every buyer should be asking their prospective buyer agents. This is a two-part series. In part one, I'll talk about the cases and the effect they're having on the industry. And in part two, I'll discuss what kinds of questions you should ask of your buyer agent you are considering of hiring and why each is important. So stay tuned. You know, there was a recent survey done where over 1,000 consumers were asked if they knew how buyer agents were paid. Only 26% said they had any idea how buyer agents made money. So I think a great place to start this discussion is by explaining how buyer agency came into being and how buyer agents are paid. The very first real estate cooperation groups were started in the late 1800s. Now, most current multiple listing services were founded in the 1950s and 1960s. These were a cooperative agreement for listing agents to pay other agents from competing brokerages a portion of their listing fee, a number that the listing agent determined, if another agent found a buyer for their listing. This fee was listed with the property and it was unconditional. This means the buyer agent got that fee regardless of the offer they brought to the listing agent. At that time, all agents who were members of the MLS represented the seller, and there was no such thing as a buyer agent. Starting in Hawaii and working its way east was the concept of a buyer agent. In the 1990s, buyer agency was established in the MLS system, but the old system of the listing agent sharing their fee with an agent that brought a buyer remained. Buyer agency did not mean that buyers paid for the representation. It meant that the buyers had agents looking out for their interests for the first time. And for almost 30 years, this hybrid system stayed in place, up until recently. Which brings me to the lawsuits. All of the suits in play today revolve around one subject: buyer agent commissions, and whether or not they have been kept artificially high through collusion. There are two facets to the lawsuits. The first revolves around NAR rules. Most MLSs around the country require an agent to be a member of the NAR, which in turn means they must follow NAR rules. And the NAR has a rule that says a listing agent must pay a buyer agent commission. Now, they don't specify how much should be paid, only that it is non-zero. The plaintiffs in these cases have said that the very fact that this rule exists is a form of collusion. The second facet of these cases is that the plaintiffs have offered evidence in the form of internal company documentation and video purporting to show a coordinated effort to get sellers to increase real estate fees. They also have evidence that agents were steering clients away from homes where the seller was offering lower commissions. The first of these cases, launched in Missouri in 2019, just concluded. There were 5 defendants: the NAR, and the 4 largest brokerages in the United States. Before the trial, 2 of the defendants settled, one for $55 million, the other for $85 million. The 3 other defendants stuck it out to the end. After everybody rested, the jury deliberated for 3 whole hours before they came back with a $1.8 billion judgment against the remaining defendants. Since that judgment, another of the defendants decided to settle for $70 million. Now, our judicial system allows for appeals, and the remaining defendants have vowed to do just that. So in reality, it'll take years before all of this will wind its way through the courts before the final verdict is in. Now, if you want to find out more details about these cases, currently numbering at 23, the web address on my screen will give you the nitty-gritty details of all of them. But what is not going to take years is the decoupling of buyer agent and seller agent commissions. That has already happened here in the Willamette Valley MLS, and other MLSs will follow suit. Our brand new listing paperwork that we were required to start using on January 2nd of this year has a line item for the listing agent commission, a separate line item for the buyer agent commission that is paid directly from the seller to the buyer agent on behalf of the buyer. The listing agent doesn't get to decide anymore how much to pay the buyer agent. There is also an acknowledgement that the seller understands that they are not obligated to pay any buyer agent commission because the buyer agent commission offering is between the buyer and seller, and this is a big deal. The commission is now part of the contract and as such can change. In the past, the buyer agent commission was unconditional, no matter the details of the offer, but no longer. If the buyer agent writes a really low offer, the seller can counter by reducing or eliminating the buyer agent commission that they had originally offered. If the buyer asks for repairs, the buyer agent commission can be changed as part of the repair negotiation. At the end of the day, here in the Willamette Valley MLS, buyers are now responsible for negotiating and paying their buyer agent fees. Not to say that sellers are paying zero in buyer agent commissions. The percentages are starting to drop, but sellers are still willing to pay some. But the important thing to remember is that they don't have to, and that buyer agent commissions are now fluid, almost all the way to closing. Well, as you can imagine, this is going to be a rough transition for everyone. For buyers, they have been told for decades that buyer agency is free. Now, it's never been free. It's always been baked in the price of a home, but it felt free because the buyer agent commission didn't show up on a buyer settlement statement and buyers didn't have to write a check. Most buyers like the idea of having independent representation, but they are unaccustomed to having to pay for it. And for buyer agents, it will of course be far worse because for the first time ever, they will have to justify their fees to their clients. No more skipping the whole subject. They're going to have to talk about how they're paid and what they are doing for that pay. They will have to convince their clients that they're worth the money. And that's a lot harder to do when it's clear that your services are no longer free. And I have a theory about why it's harder. When something is free, most folks are far more tolerant of ineptitude. Now, we hear consumers all the time complain bitterly on online forums about their buyer agents and how bad they are. But when you ask them why they stick with somebody they are so unhappy with, the answer is always something along the lines of, well, they're a nice person and they have some spent time with me showing me houses and their services are free, so I feel like I owe it to them to stick with them. So they're unhappy enough with the service that they are receiving that they're complaining about it online, but because it's free, they tolerate it and they don't fire their agent. When it's free, all is forgiven. I got a priceless confirmation of my theory about this from my son. He recently graduated from college and was back home with us for a short while applying for jobs. So we started going out for long bike rides together. But his bike started to have shifting problems that kept on coming back no matter how many times we took it to the shop. We finally had a more experienced mechanic look at it, and he determined there was a critical part that needed to be replaced. They didn't have it in stock, but he adjusted the bike as best he could so we could ride while we waited for the part. And the next day we went on a ride and his bike was worse than ever. I mean, it was all but unrideable. And my son was angry about it. He started railing about the bike, the mechanic, and the bike shop. It actually got a little uncomfortable and I finally said to him, "Bud, we know a part is broken. They've ordered it and they've set their bike up as best they could with what they had to work with. Give them a break." And my son says back, "Dad, it just chaps me to no end that you paid good money to have this bike fixed and they allowed this piece of garbage to even leave their shop." And that's when I corrected him and told him, well, they didn't charge me. And he was shocked. And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, they're going to charge me when the part comes in and they have to tear your bike apart and put it back together. But this adjustment didn't cost a thing." And my son's demeanor changed instantly. He went, "Oh, wow, that's okay then. They did the best they could." I mean, he went from being so angry, he was ready to hang the mechanic in effigy, and 3 seconds later, all is forgiven. all because he found out that I didn't pay a whole $25 to have his bike adjusted. And this principle is the same with buyer agents. When it's free, all is forgiven. But what's going to become crystal clear to consumers very soon is that buyer agency isn't free. And this is what's going to be the difficult transition for everybody. Buyer agents will have to explain what they're doing and why they're worth potentially tens of thousands of dollars. And buyers who aren't actively looking for more drama in their lives will have to start asking a lot of questions of their agents and perhaps even firing a buyer agent or two after they've shown them some homes. While this will likely be a painful transition, in the end, this will be good for the industry and consumers alike. Consumers will end up with far more professional representation. So why will consumers get more professional representation? Let me give you just one example. Anybody who's been watching my channel or has been to our website knows that we are big neighborhood folks, and we have been for decades. Almost 10 years ago, we created a neat tool called the Salem Neighborhood Quiz. It's a 10-question quiz that asks about your preferences in a neighborhood, and then we match the best 5 or 6 neighborhoods to your answers and send you a report on each of them. It's a great place for both of us to start a home search. But creating the quiz was a monumental task. My wife Melina profiled over 100 neighborhoods, finding the exact boundaries, profiling every home in the neighborhood so we could properly score each neighborhood. I created the algorithm for scoring and the back end for the entire quiz, and I also maintain the quiz. I keep the data updated. Suffice to say, a huge effort in terms of time and money, and our clients love it. But for every person I talk to who takes the quiz and says, Kyle, this is great information, I want to work with you, 9 people tell me, well, I'm already working with an agent, but they don't know anything about Salem or the neighborhoods in Salem, so I'm doing a little research on my own and came across your website, your neighborhood quiz, and this is great information. But I'm good. I don't need your help. I actually had one consumer in December, and this is not the first time I've heard this, tell me that their agent sent them to our website to gather neighborhood information they didn't know. In no other industry anywhere on earth does this dynamic play out like this. I mean, can you imagine if you needed to hire a doctor or a surgeon, an attorney, a financial advisor, or any other professional, and they told you to go get critical information from a competitor and then come back? Would you ever come back? Of course you wouldn't. But in real estate, this happens every day all across the country. And it is only happening because of the perception that buyer agency is free. When consumers start getting pressured to sign buyer agent agreements before they walk into a single home with an agent, something that 7 states already require, and Oregon will soon join that list, agreements that will put them on the hook for paying their agent out of pocket if necessary, buyers are going to have to do something they haven't had to do. Ask a lot of questions before they hire an agent, and even perhaps start firing a buyer agent after they've shown them a few homes. When they are on the hook to pay their buyer agent, buyers will seek out the best representation they can. The alternative is to write a check for 10 to 15 grand to somebody who you don't think knows what they are doing, or just skipping potentially good homes altogether because the seller isn't paying enough. So that wraps up part 1 of this series. In part 2, we're going to cover the questions to ask as you're interviewing buyer agents. I'll see you next time.